Okay, well, why don't we get started? So, as I mentioned, my name is Grant. This is the January webinar for CSTN. This month's session is titled Same Shelter, Unequal Outcomes, Why Black Guests Still Face Barriers to Housing. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. So I acknowledge that I'm situated on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Lenape, and Neutral Attawandaron peoples, and I honor and respect the history, languages, and culture of the diverse Indigenous people who call this territory home. And I'm always grateful to really have the opportunity to live and play on this land and do this work for CSTN on this land. But I also want to recognize too that CSTN is a national network. So from coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. And one way I do that is by subscribing to land acknowledgements, by personally stating what I can do as a treaty person. So I encourage others to seek learning and discourse about Indigenous communities. And those that learn, please share with others and please ensure we are sharing truth. I'm working every day to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing into my professional practice when appropriate, and I try my best to approach it with cultural humility. A few housekeeping items before we get started. One is I believe that all of on your computers are muted, and this is just because we're a large audience and really want to try to minimize any kind of background noise that might be distracting. Um, Attendees, though, can ask questions at any time. I ask that you put them in the Q&A box. Please do not put them in the chat box. That's a little bit more difficult to monitor, so please use the Q&A box because we will have time at the end to respond to your questions. Um, the webinar itself is being recorded, just so that you are aware. And the webinar recording and the slides will be posted on the CSTN website following the session. And our website is transformshelter.ca. Our session today is a maximum of 90 minutes. And within that 90 minutes, we will have time for presentation and about 20, 30 minutes at the end for Q&A between attendees and our guest speakers for this month. So for those of you who may be newer to CSTN, a little bit of background. We are a growing network of shelter leaders and organizations across Canada who share a mission that really is a simple one, but quite powerful. We try to connect and support shelters that are committed to becoming housing focused and to being engines for ending homelessness. We are in the process of trying to build a national movement that helps shelters do this work more intentionally. And we do that in a few different ways, but we do it primarily through learning, peer connection, and shared advocacy. So really at its heart, CSTN is about equipping shelters to help people move forward faster with dignity and housing at the center of everything that we do. So how does CSTN actually support shelters doing this work? First, through things like today's event, like webinars and learning sessions, many which are led by shelters or people that are connected to shelter work, then folks that are already on this journey of doing housing-focused shelter transformation. Second, we offer a self-assessment tool that was developed by OrgCode that is hosted on the website that can help you see where your organization is at in the process of becoming housing focused and be able to identify any areas for growth in order to have greater alignment to the model. And third, we're creating more opportunities for peer learning and sharing. So today's session is just one example um, because we know that the best ideas really kind of come from the field. And so you'll see in the corner there, there's a QR code that will, if you scan that, maybe with the camera on your phone, it will take you to a registration link if you're interested to becoming a member of CSTN. Membership is completely free, and we invite everybody to be a part of this growing community. So you get to decide how active or passive you are in your membership. You could just agree to receive updates about CSTN activities, attend webinars, but you could also be more active by potentially leading sessions or to helping develop or share materials that will help shelters across the country. So at our website too, you can see if you're not able to attend our webinars as they occur. live. We do archive them all at the CSTN website, and you and your staff can watch them when you do have the opportunity to. So have a look there at transformshelter.ca to find those. But then also on the website, you'll see there is an inventory of lots and lots of resources that have either been developed by CSTN and its members or other shelters across North America. And this is just a way to be able to share peer-to-peer and different tools, resources, things like that, without feeling like as if you have to create everything from scratch when you're looking to develop new stuff. So if you're looking for things to help you with some transformation stuff, like, I don't know, maybe policies around how to accommodate pets in shelter, look on the website. If you think you have really great tools at your shelter that you want to share with your peers across the country that you would love to have hosted on the website, reach out to me directly via email, and I'm happy to have a conversation. So today's session is part of an ongoing series of monthly sessions that we do. And really today we're going to spend some time unpacking a bit about how anti-Black racism shows up in housing and shelter systems and explore what shelters can do to change outcomes. So drawing on research, lived experience, and real world examples, our presenters today are going to help attendees identify how shelter policies, practices, and partnerships can be adjusted to advance equity and ensure that being housing focused also means that at the same time we're being equity focused. This is just a bit of our outline for today. You'll see there too that after the presentations, as I mentioned, there's time for questions from attendees and then closing remarks. So some attendees may be asking themselves, like, why is addressing anti-Black racism essential to ensuring a housing-focused shelter approach leads to to equitable housing outcomes? So, like, essentially, how is anti-Black racism essential in addressing if we're talking about housing-focused shelter work? Well, if you recall, housing-focused shelter service orientation is it's really kind of has these kind of underpinnings. Sorry, let me fix my wording there. Housing focused shelters have certain service orientation considerations that underpin the work that we do. And so the two that I really want to highlight and how they align with today's topic is culturally appropriate and safe service, and the other is person-centered care. So addressing anti-Black racism really matters because housing outcomes aren't just about units or vacancies in housing. They're about how people experience the system. So if we want shelters to be truly housing focused, we have to recognize that Black people often face unique and persistent barriers rooted in racism. So being culturally appropriate means understanding those realities and perhaps adjusting our policies and practices and developing partnerships so we're not unintentionally setting people up to fail. This also connects directly to safe person-centered care. So safety isn't only about physical space, right? It's also about whether people feel respected, believed, and supported. So when shelters actively work to address racism, they build trust with their shelter guests. That trust makes it easier for people to engage in housing conversations, take risks, and move forward. So in short, housing focused work only succeeds when it's also equity focused and it's grounded in dignity. And so just a little bit around setting the stage before I pass it over to our speakers. We know that we see higher rates of homelessness amongst amongst Black people. So this slide shows a clear disparity. Black people make up about 4% of Canada's population, but about 8% of those counted as experiencing homelessness. And so racialized groups are also more likely to use shelters overall. So that tells us that there's an inequity that's built into who ends up in the system in the first place, not just what happens once people are inside it. The second point on this slide uh, really is addressing the racial disparity in who exits shelter and who potentially re-enter shelter or re-experiences homelessness. So while there isn't Canadian data that directly reports differences in exit rates and re-entry by race, although they do in the United States, um, there are credible findings that show racial disparities. So from many communities, we see in their homelessness information system that Black households had slower placements into housing and similar returns to shelter and homelessness compared with white households. And once housed, Black households were 19% more likely to return to homelessness or to shelter after placement in some type of permanent supportive housing, which speaks to racialized patterns embedded in not just exits into housing, but also in the retention of housing in our system of care. And the last point that I want to touch on is racial inequities that extend to also to youth adults. So studies indicate that Black young adults exiting homelessness are significantly more likely to re-enter homelessness than white peers, reinforcing that disparities persist across age groups. So this isn't just a family or adult issue, it's also impacting younger people. So with that, I just want to take a moment to introduce our speakers that will be leading today's session. So please welcome Dr. Prentice Dantzler. Uh, Dr. Dantzler is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and founding director of the Housing Justice Lab within the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. He also holds positions with the Departments of Geography and Planning and Social Justice Education. As an interdisciplinary community engaged scholar, his work focuses on how and why neighborhoods change and the extent to which policymakers, institutions, local organizations, and community members create and react to those changes. He received his PhD in Public Affairs and Master of Science in Community Development from Rutgers University Camden. And joining him today also is Ashley Wilkinson. Ashley is a health sciences PhD candidate at the University of Northern British Columbia, building on a master's in health sciences with a specialization in Indigenous and Northern health from Lakehead University. She has several years of experience in health research related to community health and social issues for marginalized groups across diverse urban, rural, and remote geographies. Her broader research interests include health equity, anti-racism, Indigenous health, and she's committed to community-engaged research approaches that center the voices of those most affected by systemic inequities. So a big welcome to the both of you, and we do really appreciate you being here, and we're excited to hear what you have to share with the network today. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and pass it over to the both of you. Welcome.
Thanks, Grant. It's good to be here with everybody today. Thank you for coming, showing up. Hopefully, you're staying warm as I pull up the presentation for today. Um, I want to just say thank you for Grant for the invitation as well. It's been Ash and I have been excited to share some of this work with you all, and hopefully, you can see the screen at this point. And so part of what we're going to do today is kind of reaffirm a lot of the work that I know a lot of you are doing in this space across if you're working in shelters or local municipalities, or even broader, bigger organizations. There's a lot of work and a lot of research been done on housing, given that we have a national housing crisis, as we know. I think the other thing is that we want to share some of the stories about what's been working or what some of the barriers that other organizations and municipalities have been dealing with. And so, in order to do that, I think we want to kind of frame this, as Grant has says, that this is not an individual problem. This is a systemic problem. And there's a lot of ways in which I think we kind of treat housing as this kind of individual thing that people obtain and they kind of stay in. But a lot of us know that there's a lot of entry and exits, not just with the housing, but neighborhoods and communities themselves. And so for us, it begs the question how much these kind of issues about racial residential stability and homelessness are actually impacting neighborhoods and communities to kind of live and thrive and not just resist some of the issues in terms of housing affordability. And so, as you can see on this left side of the our title screen, it's really kind of looking at this ideology or this thinking about home ownership or housing for everybody. And a lot of times, I think for people in this group, we don't take that for granted. We know a lot of people in this space do not have the same type of access to homeownership or the same type of access to just stable housing, stable, safe, and secure housing for themselves or even for their families. And so I hope that we can get into a better discussion. And as we talked about before, this is a system, right? And so a lot of us might be working on the left end of this kind of non-market housing, as we call it, whether you're working in homelessness or services or emergency shelters, even transitional housing. As we know, there's a lot of conversation on expanding the housing kind of system, particularly in the realm of affordable housing. And the other issue with that is that every level of government has a different definition of that. And so for some of us, it's thinking about 80% of area median income, but even that's not hitting a lot of the households that we deal with on a or we try to service or work with on a day-to-day basis. And so, as you can see, it has this kind of natural or this implied natural tendency that people just float across these spaces. And but the other thing is, a lot of people get stuck, right, for barriers outside of the housing market in and of itself, but also people find home and community in some various versions of this housing tenure system, right? And so, just because you live in community or social housing doesn't mean that it's necessary that that's be a temporary place to live. Although a lot of the ways and policies and practices support that tend to be in that vein. We also know that Canada's housing affordability crisis may persist for years, right? And so, as much work has been doing across levels of government to build more housing, it takes a long time for housing to come online. And so, as being mostly based out of the city of Toronto, there's going to be a lot of conversations about experiences within this particular city, but also drawing insights from other places around the country. But again, this is a waiting game for a lot of institutions and a lot of organizations to see if they can take hold of some of the benefits of this new housing construction boom. There is a problem with a lot of the ways in which we think about the housing space in and of itself. And so this is not unique to Canada or big cities in Canada in and of itself. This is a global issue. And so globally, there's an affordable housing crisis, particularly in large scale urban areas or cities that are increasing in population size. And so we see in the US and Canada specifically, working households are increasingly more likely to be renters, while homeownership drives a lot of the planning and urban development strategies that we've seen, right? And so we see this in the place of Toronto. There was a lot of focus on condo development with the idea that a lot of homeowners would take possession of those units. And what we've seen in the past few years is that that market is having a big dip, right? People are not taking ownership of those units. And so those units are becoming more rental properties, actually helping out in the terms of the rental supply, but still having bigger and raising bigger questions about the long-term issues about obtaining a place to live if you're going to be a homeowner. Governments have largely shifted away from social housing as a viable option. The kind of moniker we keep hearing is affordable housing, with conversations and debates and support for different forms like community or social housing within that. But that's still a big umbrella term. And so for a lot of us that are more in thinking about long-term support, I think these kind of non-market or kind of decommodified, because they're all within the same housing market. These kind of decommodified ways to think about housing might be a long approach. But we've also seen increases in other ways that kind of provide houses. And so a lot of you may know about the housing benefit programs or housing allowances that go to different tenants or renters across the country. There's increasing support for mixed income communities or complete communities where there are like set aside units in and of itself dedicated to affordable housing based on some type of income levels. Um, but again, a lot of this is relied upon kind of this understanding of what I call dispossession displacement, embedding in how we do housing turnover, right? And so the idea is that you have cheap land that you're like focusing on, but it really relies on that land being undervalued or lower value for the idea that we can build more housing. And so what we've seen now is that a lot of ways in the government is taking advantage of using public lands, even in the quest of having these kind of long-term obligations or negotiations with indigenous communities to reclaim land for themselves. The perspective on housing affordability, I'm looking at Toronto specifically because that's been a lot of the work that I'll be conditioning today. But you see these kind of affordability levels in terms of how much percent of median income they're actually spending on their housing costs, right? And so even if you look at monthly mortgage payments on median home price, you see stark increases over time, even in those kind of gray areas of global or like national economic swings. And so the 2008, 2009 great financial crisis, but even COVID, where we start to see some dips, but stark increases in the prices of these housing issues of housing affordability. And when you look at it across some of the bigger cities and even across the country as whole, these kind of mirror each other. So it's not something that's kind of unique to just big cities. Even smaller cities across Canada are also experiencing large forms of housing affordability issues. More recently, in the fall, there's been a lot of talk about the federal government getting back into the business of building more housing, and so there's been a lot of questions about what that looks like, right? And the part of the kind of mantra of Build Canada Homes is to build more houses, more affordable units at lower costs, and using the resources of public land to do that, while also kind of investing in different types of housing innovation programs. But again, right, as we're waiting for a lot of this housing to come on or a lot of investments across the country, the question that still remains, who are they building for? And even a lot of the kind of households that are more vulnerable to being housing insecure, are they going to actually be able to take advantage of a lot of the support or the processes once these housing units become online? Affordability is not equal, right? And so affordability pressures or displacement pressures do not fit Canadians across racial groups equally. And as Grant had noted in the beginning of the introduction, Black households are having some of the highest issues of housing insecurity, but they don't have the top issues of housing affordability. And so there's bigger questions about how affordability is actually relating to people getting into the housing market, right? And so this is a 2021 picture of the proportion of households in affordable housing by race. We also know that there's a lot of returns, right? So the recidivism within homelessness or homeless counts, right? And so the national median rate remained low throughout the period from this January 24 to March 25. This is reported on a national level, but we still see stark increases in the median rates of returns to homelessness, right? So even if people are getting access to housing, that's not to say that they're going to be secure in that place long term. And this gets a lot of ways in which we start to see people kind of re-entering the shelter system or re-entering a lot of the social programs that typically will be thought about to build or help them out in that space. When we think about percentage of households in core housing need by priority population, this also has a star claim of thinking about which households, right? There's an intersectional lens that we have to think about. Like, there's not just a race issue, there's an age issue where you see older households are less likely to have secure housing. You also see issues around visa status or immigration status that's also kind of impacting this. Even less when we think about there's other issues about people actually gaining access to housing that may have some mental or physical needs or accessibility issues, right? And so, kind of thinking about, are we building housing that's actually matching the needs of the population that are most vulnerable to this space? There's also a gender dynamic in this, right? And so this is based on the last report from the Needs Toronto Needs Assessment, where you see that men over women, there's more likely in terms of identity of the respondents, right? And to be clear, this is not when we do the counts in terms of point in time counts, um, these ideas are like what are visible at that point in time, right? And so there's a lot of ways in which we might be undercounting different populations or different households within this space. And so we should think about this as like people that are visibly homeless instead of just thinking about the overall homeless population. So I would argue that a lot of these numbers are probably underestimating how many people are actually experiencing homeless or experiencing housing insecurity at any given point in time. Within these numbers, you see that a lot more people of single adults tend to be men, but a lot when you think about family dynamics tend to be women led or female led in this space. And as Grant noted in the beginning, there's a huge increase or a big increase in terms of how we think about youth engaging in that. And research in the US and Canada will tell you that the probability of individual experiencing homelessness is very high in their earlier years of their adulthood. It dips down and goes back up in their later years of life. In terms of the racial identity, right? And so, Canada has this long history of being what we think about in terms of this kind of multicultural space. But even within that, a lot of times we have that overlaps or collapses identity within these kind of broad categories, right? And so a lot of us know about these kind of racialized minorities or visible minorities and a lot of data sets. But that may actually mask who's actually experiencing homelessness or who's actually experiencing housing insecurity when you kind of disaggregate that data. And so within the space that I'll talk about with my lab has been doing, and with the help of people like RAs like Ashley, we've been trying to think about disaggregating some of this data, looking at who's actually experiencing some of these issues more so than other households. And so even here we see that more than three quarters, 77% of respondents identified as a member of a racialized group, compared to 56% of the general population in Toronto. At the time of the survey, 63% of all racialized respondents reported that they arrived as refugee claimants, right? And so there is this kind of notion, or this kind of notion that people within the shelter system, but also immigration policy, is like, how much are we just creating these pipelines to homelessness in and of itself? If we're increasing the amount of immigrants in a particular space, are there actually needs or resources there for them to take advantage on, to actually have secure housing? Even when we think about the racial identity of the respondents, right? The Toronto Needs and Shelter Assessment really showed that some of the biggest increase were among the Black population. And even when you disaggregated that out from like Afro Caribbean or Afro Latinx, you have a huge proportion of those new respondents, or the respondents being identifying as Black. And so, again, what does this mean about the racialization of homelessness and poverty in and of itself? And so, about a year and a half ago at this point, with the help of some support from the School of Cities at the University of Toronto, I started a research lab, particularly focused on like three areas, as well. And so, to back up for a second, I'm American. I've been in Toronto about 5 years now. I've been working in this housing space since around like 2010. I'm also a landlord, so I can see it from that point of view in Toronto and in the United States. And so there's some stories there, that I'll probably share at the course of this talk. And so I do this from like an applied experience, so even working with community organizations around Toronto, but also from a practitioner experience, having formerly worked with case management and social support services in the US as well. And then a lot of the work that we've been doing today really looks at displacement, particularly Black displacement. And so the lab's work is rooted in a community development perspective. And within this, to these points, we really focus on local control or community control, right? How have communities always resisted some of the issues that are facing them, and how have they created new, innovative, and rarely creative ways to deal with local issues? And so for me, it's about kind of building capacity for organizations that are on this call to do the work that they need to do, as well, and not be as top down as a lot of the government policy tends to be. And so the lab itself is kind of split up into three initiatives. The first research initiative is Racial Equity and Anti-Displacement Initiative. And I think what Ashley and I are going to do is kind of give you a framing of how the housing system actually works, right? And so it's not just that the fact that people are living in place. There's a lot of ways in which people are navigating, facing a lot of barriers to gain access to suitable housing. This work kind of started with some reports years ago, and so there's Scott Leon and James Eviniak did a report with the Wellesley Institute looking at kind of ethno-racial minorities in Canada, particularly around eviction rates, and found a lot of issues with a lot of Black neighborhoods with higher percentages of Black households having higher percentages of eviction filings. And since about the last 10 years, ever since sociologist Matt Desmond and some others kind of really promoted the idea of eviction as a understudied housing issue, we've had a lot more of attention on it across the two countries. And so here I want to shout out Julie Miles, a professor at the University of Toronto, who's creating an eviction lab right now through a new housing alternatives housing partnership that we're both on. And then Nimoy Lewis at TMU, who's doing a lot of this work as well, really showing the disproportionate rate of Black households facing that. And so, but a lot of this work initially was like based on this idea of having this visible minority group. And so, in a lot of the research reports we see, there's always this kind of non-racial, racial kind of categories, and treats it very binary. But the question becomes, what happens when you look or disaggregate that data out? Are all kind of racialized groups experiencing homelessness in the same ways? And what we can expect that is probably not. And so some of what the report said earlier, and some of the news coverage on, is that 1 in 4 racialized tenants in Toronto neighborhoods risk eviction. And so my team and I, a couple other colleagues, a couple of RAs that are currently graduate students, Khalil Martin and Abby Miguel, who's our research assistant. We had a paper editorial that came out a couple months ago, really looking at in Toronto, who gets evicted isn't random. It really follows the city's racial economic divides, right? And so while we have these kind of monikers or these ideologies of being a very much multicultural space, Toronto has proportions of communities that are either segregated or self-preference into particular ethnic communities. What we found was when we looked at data, right? And so we looked at eviction filings and across the city. There's two big things that kind of stood out about us is that, and we kind of expected some of these results. One is that neighborhoods with higher percentages of dwellings in need of serious repair, and we'd expect that you could think about a neighborhood with older housing units, homeowners or property owners that may not have enough money to reinvest in those units based on fixed incomes or lower incomes. They also have higher issues of eviction filings. And so there's a lot of ways that this happens. Sometimes you have landlords kind of intentionally not reinvesting in their units to cause it to disrepair, right? With this idea that they can constantly flip or take advantage of higher rental rates. The other issue is in the same space is that some of these units, people or landlords or property owners don't have enough money, right? And so they're trying to ride out that in the same space, given a little bit of affordable housing crises. In the same way, when you look at the percentage of visible minority households, right? And so the concentration of racialized households within any particular community or census tract, as we do here, you also see a positive relationship that the more kind of a diverse a community is within these spaces, or racially mixed or racially non-white, the higher percentages of eviction filings in that neighborhood too, right? And that's when you even control for income. And so there's a lot of ways in which kind of these displacement pressures are following racialized households in and of themselves. But what you can kind of see from this graph is that it's not fitting all racialized groups or hitting each racialized groups evenly. And so when you disaggregate some of these kind of eviction filings out by racial groups, and so we looked at black, white, we looked at black, South Asian, Chinese, and Filipino households given their percentage population makeup of the city. What we saw is that black, South Asian, Filipino households or neighbor communities with those more of those households in their areas have higher rates of eviction, but we saw an inverse relationship when it came to Chinese households. And so Chi Tam at the Toronto Chinatown Land Trust, I remember a few years ago, I was asking her about this. And we talked about homeownership rates as well, right? And so the issue of like people becoming new immigrants or newcomers coming over to actually gain access to housing, where you see in certain communities there is an inverse relationship of evictions, and so some of these individuals may be able to take advantage of buying houses while others can't. And so there's a stark inverse relationship where you see like the proportion of black households uh, rate goes up in the neighborhood, the proportion of eviction filings go up. The inverse relationship was found when we looked at Chinese households in the particular neighborhoods. And so, what does this kind of take away from this initial study? One is that not all households or not all filings equal displacement. But there's a lot of legal tools that are at play that make households more vulnerable to experiencing eviction rates. And so again, Nimoy Lewis and his colleagues, they just had a paper that came out in the last couple of weeks looking at even when you control for like income levels and you look at some of the neighborhoods that have higher percentages of black households at higher incomes, you still see higher rates of eviction filings, particularly about among financialized landlords. And we can understand financialized landlords are kind of apartment buildings or housing units that are operated by financialized actors, real estate investment teams, property management groups, and so on and so forth, right? Because the idea is that they're trying to worry about more turnover versus about secure housing. Eviction in itself is racialized, right? Yet missing from housing policy debates. And a lot of this is based on a data justice issue. A lot of us in the space that do more quantitative work have been calling for disaggregated race-based data. Even the city of Toronto has the CABR unit that did a lot of work kind of spelling out what needs to be done, but the city has been slow to respond across all levels of government or all departments, I should say. Um, the growth agendas risk deepening racialized displacement, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later in this presentation around there's a lot of development going on, but if the average kind of building in, at least in the city of Toronto, takes about 6 to 7 years to build, how many households are we losing waiting for that new housing to come online? And so who's in more precarious positions? And I think, like, and lastly, in terms of saying this, is that a racial lens is essential to protect vulnerable renters and advance equity, right? If you're just looking at racialized versus white communities, you're probably missing some of the stories based on those respective individual experiences that households or communities are facing and embracing the housing market. And we'll share some more results from some studies based on the audit study that we did in the rental market itself. I'll pass it over to Ashley.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Dantzler. So building on this discussion around a need for race-based data, a couple of years ago, I was able to lead a project looking at the prevalence of Black homelessness across Canada. And as many of you know, this is a topic that is newer in the research world. There's not as much data collected on this, and certainly not as much published in an academic space. So it really is an emerging conversation. And so the way we did this was we did a secondary analysis of community homeless counts, so point in time counts, period prevalence counts. We started by looking at 61 designated communities who participated in the 2018 count, and kind of build off from there. So our findings in terms of the representation of Black people experiencing homelessness are here in the table on the right. But I want to talk you through some of our key findings, really 3 points. So the first thing, again, building on the discussion from Dr. Dantzler so far, is that Black people are overrepresented among those experiencing homelessness across Canada, in all of the counts that we looked at. And in some communities, the prevalence was extremely high. Since we actually produced this paper, this has gone even more severe. So in communities like Toronto, where the prevalence used to be 31%, now, as of last year, the prevalence is 58% of those experiencing homelessness identifying as Black. So we've seen this go up nearly twofold just in the last 2 years. The other thing that we saw was a significant gap in the way that Black homelessness is reported. So, firstly, out of those 61 designated communities that we talked about, only 16 provided disaggregated data on Black homelessness. For the majority of those communities, the data was presented as an other or racialized category, which, as Dr. Dantzler mentioned, really loses the nuance. It's not effective for service providers, and it's not effective for policymakers because if we don't understand who is experiencing homelessness in our communities, it's really hard to make sure that those individuals are connected with the supports and services that they need. And finally, we talked about the fact that in many of the communities, Black was the only identifier given. Again, as many of you on this call know, and I'm sure can relate to, identity is a deeply personal topic. And by giving people only one option, number one, you're removing a lot of the autonomy from individuals. But secondly, again, we're not able to get an understanding of who is experiencing homelessness in our communities. As many of you know from the work that you do, it's so important to recognize that individuals require different supports. I was just talking about this yesterday in my lecture at the university where I'm teaching, and newcomer families, for example, are going to require very different supports than individuals who have grown up in the system or individuals who are Canadian born but maybe have a stronger support system. Very different needs in terms of resources, a very different outcomes that we can expect. So it's really important to get a deeper understanding. And again, for the majority of enumerations we looked at, about 58%, Black was the only category. So we really highlighted through this paper, which you can find if you're interested, we can also provide the link through Grant. We really highlighted these 3 key areas. If you can go to the next slide, please. The other thing I wanted to take a minute to talk about is some ongoing research that we're doing related to race and homelessness as barriers to healthcare. This is actually my own doctoral dissertation research. And this came about because while there are studies that have shown racialized individuals and people experiencing homelessness face health disparities, there's a lack of research examining the intersection of both of those two factors. So for the past year, I've been going across the country, conducting interviews with Black and Indigenous people with lived experience of homelessness. In 4 cities, we went to Prince George, BC, Calgary, Alberta, Thunder Bay, Ontario, and in Toronto, of course. And the key finding here that I wanted to highlight is that when seeking and accessing care, both Black and Indigenous peoples experiencing homelessness face a an innumerable number of barriers across a spectrum, everything from stigma and microaggressions, negative attitudes from providers, all the way to discrimination, overt racism, including racial slurs and derogatory language, and physical violence, all of which negatively impact their care-seeking behaviors. And this is really important. So I want to highlight and take a moment to share some of the voices from my participants. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to read these quotes. I'm going to give you a minute to read them because I really like individuals' voices to speak for themselves. But these are 2 quotes from participants I spoke to in Toronto. And I think it really encapsulates the way that the racism comes through in a healthcare setting. So I'll just give you a minute to read those. And now some of you are probably thinking, well, how does this relate to our day-to-day work? And the reality is it's so important to understand the barriers that your clients are facing because these barriers exist not just in the healthcare system. These barriers create negative feelings towards themselves. The continuation of the quote on the left actually speaks to this woman internalizing some of that racism and having it change the way that she views herself as a Black woman experiencing homelessness in the system. It has impacts on not only their care seeking behaviors, but their approach to shelters, whether they choose to stay, how they feel about the shelter system. And so there are significant impacts based on these experiences that they're having elsewhere in the system because of A, their racial identity, but also their identity as someone experiencing homelessness. So again, this research is still ongoing, but I really wanted to highlight it here to share some of those implications and acknowledge the fact that we do need to be having these conversations, particularly around the experiences that Black people are having who are facing homelessness, because it is such an under-researched area. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. And so part of what Ashley pointed out is that kind of some of the barriers in terms of getting access, and I kind of started here with this. Last year, we had a report that was an earlier version of this report that just came out. This article with Paul Acabre and Jason Eckworth and colleagues looking at fielding a field experiment in the rental market, right? And so what they did was they had an audit study, which is a very common practice in U.S. housing policy, given federal level of discrimination or anti-discrimination laws, but not much of a common practice in a Canadian context. And so this is something that probably is one of the best approaches to really see individual barriers to gaining access into the rental market. And so if you think about it as an experiment, and you can look at these two pictures, right? What they did was they had avatars on Kijiji and use those in the responses to landlords based on various rental listings online. And then what they did was compare the responses by landlords across different neighborhoods based on their responses to these avatars, right? And so you could see, and so what they found was that white tenants or white prospective tenants were more likely to gain favorable or positive responses from their landlords versus Black tenants. Now let's dig into some of these numbers a little bit to kind of show you how stark it was, right? And so when you think about the percentage of queries where the landlord replied with yes, is this apartment still available? White tenants had about a 78% response rate, while Black tenants only had a 54%, right? And there was nothing different, pretty much different about the outcalls or the responses other than the avatar of the listing in and of itself. So in apartment buildings, you saw a big disparity. Even if they were renting a room in the house, there was a smaller but notable disparity. Condominiums as well, you had over 80% for that, while Black respondents only had about 67%. And then even if they were renting out an entire home, you see these disparities. And so what is that telling you? Is even in the case where individuals are actually seeking out housing, regardless of the property type, there's still a big difference in how landlords are responding to Black versus white tenants or prospective tenants. Now, they also asked in this paper, right? Are these kind of responses equal across different types of neighborhoods, right? And so they kind of divided up the rental rates across different quartiles or different percentages. And what they found was that only in the lowest quartile, right, neighborhoods with the lowest amount of rents, did you see an equal response rate for Black and white tenants. But as the neighborhood got more expensive, landlords are being more selective, right? Or there's a big inequality in terms of how landlords are responding because they probably have a little bit more room to address who they respond to. And so you still see these big disparities in more expensive neighborhoods where you're talking 84% in quartile 3 versus about 50, probably 56%. And even in quarter 4, you still see a 21% difference between those response rates. Even when the change in rent, right? And so what about neighborhoods that are actually changing in time, right? And this kind of gets to the point of like neighborhood pressures or displacement pressures. What they found was only in neighborhoods where rental rates were declining, and this is using data from the change in rent from 2016 to 2021, did they have more favorable response rate for Black tenants. And so what is that in areas that were increasing in rent, you saw the complete opposite, right? or in neighborhoods that were slower to increase, you also start a big disparity in that. And so, what is that telling us here? Maybe, right? It's plausible that a lot of ways in which these neighborhoods are being responded to is based on the idea, right, that Black tenants or Black prospective tenants are pretty much equal or relational to lower value issues. And right, and this gets into the whole kind of racist approach to the housing market, where a lot of it is really connected to value. How do we value individual people? How do we value renters in and of themselves? And so there's a big question about valuation as it relates to the rental market. The same can be said in terms of like all visible minorities, right? But even in that, in terms of like who the actual landlord was, what are the types of neighborhoods in which those landlords, right? And so in neighborhoods where you had higher percentages of visible minorities, you still had white tenants being preferred over Black tenants. Um, Even in white majority neighborhoods, you still had a stark difference in and of itself. And I think this is the last one, but even in all these type of neighborhoods, the only neighborhoods where you saw more positive response rates based on the composition of the neighborhood in themselves were in neighborhoods that had higher proportions of Chinese households, which gives a very unique kind of understanding, and South Asian households as well, but gives a very unique understanding about who landlords are, right? And what type of communities are more accepting or welcoming to Black tenants of themselves. And at least in this case, it seems like neighborhoods with higher proportions of South Asians and Chinese may be more likely to respond to Black tenants looking for housing. In terms of what that leads us to, right, it kind of begs the question about, so what is affordable living and what does quality, and how do we kind of ensure this quality affordable, urban affordable living? And so that's the research two, or research, the second research initiative in the lab. And here I just want to highlight a recent study that we did with Moss Park Community Coalition. And this gets back to really kind of thinking about resident experiences at the local level and pointing out some of the kind of intersecting barriers or obstacles that they face living in place. And so this was based on some feedback, right? And I'll show you about this is focused on Moss Park community and the Lower East Side of downtown Toronto. Like many other neighborhoods, community advocates, there's a lot of investment coming in this place, right? There's a revamping of Moss Park, a lot of improvements. The city also reports in this particular neighborhood, given the high percentage of lower income households, that 39% of Toronto's homeless shelter response sites are in Ward 13, right? And so it's a higher proportion of people in this neighborhood needing social supports. But it's also having major investments. So Metrolinx is building a subway station for the Ontario line at the corner of Moss Park, which has also caused a lot of issues and fear among residents about being displaced in and of themselves. So they kind of give you like an aerial picture, and we did you can find more information about this at the Community Voices on the Transformation of Moss Park report at the School of Cities right now and the Research Insights. But what you see is there is some like segregation or like clustering of particular types of households. And to be clear, there's a lot of social housing in this neighborhood, right? It butts up right next to Regent Park. And for those of you that are familiar with Regent Park, that's one of the biggest kind of social housing transformations in Canada, with a lot of history in of itself, for pros and cons about what that actual development did to households in and of itself. But in our kind of community work, there's a lot of fear among residents that have been living here for long terms that are also fearful of the displacement that they may occur, based on a lot of different reasons that we'll show in a second. And so at some community events, we did surveys alongside Moss Park Community Coalition just to get a sense of some of the factors that were really affecting households or residents and some of their top priorities, right? Because I think a lot of times we have these top-down approaches or these ideas about what's really facing communities, but what if we just actually just ask residents in and of themselves? And what we found is affordable housing was one of the number one issues, or what became the number one issue. But other issues were very high, right? So community safety, and it was very complicated. Residents themselves felt insecure, unsafe in their units, but not purely by crime or any issues in the area. It was an issue of over surveillance. And so a lot of residents in this space felt like they were getting surveilled by the local police department, but also community safety officers hired by TCAC within their housing in and of themselves. This also created fear among the residents to even respond or call out issues as they arise, because they were more fearful about their tenancy being threatened in and of the space. There's a lot of issues with employment opportunities, given the limited employment opportunities within that local community and the protections for those tenants. A big thing that came up across multiple waves of these surveys was food access. And so it's not just about the understanding of being housing insecure, it's about how does housing insecurity also relate to other aspects like food insecurity. And so a lot of ways in which we've been doing work right now is that even if our gift cards, can we make sure that these gift cards are suitable just to buy family food if they're even like interacting with us in the space? And again, there was other things about community spaces, commercial spaces that some of my other colleagues have been digging more deeply into. But again, a lot of intersecting issues for families or residents living in lower income communities. Even in the city itself has put out that rent geared to income housing was the most frequently reported support that respondents said could have prevented their homelessness, right? And so there's a lot of ways in which they're calling for more housing. But again, in addition to other things like renting and legal rights was a high percentage at 42%. Support to reach education, right? How do you actually know their rights? There are also ways they think about educational workshops that the city could be doing or are doing. And so, who's actually taking advantage of those remains the questions, and how are those things actually reducing some of the barriers that we're pointing out here? And our last initiative is the kind of fostering reparative equity for empowered living initiatives, right? And so I think a lot of this work that we've been doing in this space has been thinking about what are the alternative models for actually supplying a secure housing long term. And this goes into community land trust, social housing, supportive services, transitional housing, RGI, so on and so forth. But also, how do we secure this housing for the long term? And one group I wanted to point out today that we'll probably get it. I'll probably use some of the resources in the Q&A. There's there a new housing alternatives partnership, and so this is a collective partnership among a series of academics, nonprofit organizations, government entities across the country, really thinking about how do we build an alternative housing system, right? Because we keep getting these cycles of just not having enough housing and building more housing. But in those swings of the market, a lot of people are becoming homelessness or are experiencing high forms of housing security. So how do we build a different housing system so this doesn't happen ongoing or every 10 or 20 years? And so a lot of the work in here is thinking about tenants' rights, decommodified housing, long-term government reforms and policy reforms. And so there's going to be a lot more work coming out in this group in the next 5 years. I think for us and the idea, the goal, including Ashley, is like all people deserve to live their fullest lives in any way possible, and all communities thriving interdependently. Right? You can't do this in an isolated way. If somebody's experiencing homelessness, that's also a drain on the community at large, right? Because there's different funding and support services that now we're not dedicating to other thing. And so it's our responsibility to think about our neighbor as somebody that should be supported throughout these processes. And I want to say thank you, and we're looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much to the both of you. And sorry if my dog Augie keeps coming into camera shot.
You good?
shot. He's a bit of a show dog at times. Um, so um, thank you. That was I'm just trying to process a bit. One of the things that I think that I want to direct people is right now is to say, because we're at the Q&A part of the session, if you have questions for our presenters, to please put them in the Q&A box, and I'll make sure to share them, and we can have them answered. Maybe to kind of get the ball rolling a bit, I'll put a question forward. The thing that really lots of things stood out for me in what you shared today. But the one right at the top of my head right now is that one that you shared regarding kind of the avatars and
Mhm.
showing the racial discrimination when people start to do housing searches. So knowing that they're experiencing that kind of racial discrimination, if I'm someone who's working with a Black shelter guest in shelter and about to start in that rehousing process with them, like what are maybe knowing that I can't impact large scale policy or, long-term planning around housing development within my very much frontline role in the shelter, knowing I'm going to start that rehousing process and housing search with that guest, what are maybe some of the most like impactful shifts that I can make in my practice when working with individuals that are facing that kind of discrimination that might disrupt the inequity and create a
Mhm.
greater likelihood of a better outcome for them as far as housing outflow.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, so The interesting part about this, we could draw on some of the work that's been done in the U.S. In terms of like relocating families, particularly out of public housing, and giving them a voucher to get in communities. And they said they saw similar dynamics, right? Where in higher income communities, Black tenants weren't getting access to this household or households or rentals. What they did was they had what they called navigators, and so they had navigators actually to work directly with landlords. So the landlord itself wouldn't really see the tenant at all. And so for a lot of landlords, that put a lot of less pressure on a tenant because they're dealing with like, a professional organization that's doing the deal with them, that's telling them when they're going to get their money or so on and so forth. And other ways where the tenant is going to be taken over the cultural competency of the navigators in and of themselves, right? And so if you have a predominantly South Asian community, who are you sending in that community to kind of make connections with? And while you may not have a full diverse work staff, there are other ways that you can think about partnering up with organizations or even educational higher ed institutions to kind of do that work in and of itself. And so having somebody that can speak for the tenant in that space may be a little bit more a little advantageous to actually kind of place people. I think the other piece in kind of thinking about um, some of that is to think about what are the kind of long-term strategies, or are there other ways to have landlords on a kind of floating list, right? And so as a landlord who was recently looking for a tenant, it would have been really helpful to just like put my name on a nonprofit list to say, hey, I got a unit available right now. And I don't think there's enough kind of information out there about different programs or services at the nonprofit level or the kind of local organization level where landlords who are more likely or more wanting to work with an organization to secure long-term tenancy can do that. And so I take insights from some of the situations in the US right now where in neighborhoods or in cities where you might have a lot more high capacity apartment buildings or developers in spaces. And let's take a city like Philadelphia, for instance, because I was just there. What you start to see now is that a lot of those apartment buildings that will be more resistant to like just housing anybody in their residence or their tenants are going straight to the housing authority and say, hey, can we do a deal to house your voucher holders within our space? And so that way they don't have to worry about long-term tenancy. I can see that in the same place here, which I've been kind of thinking about in terms of what would this look like, where TCAC could actually take advantage of some of the condo dips in the market right now and secure some of those kind of declining property values to gain some recently built housing for themselves, right, to put under their portfolio. And so, as an organization level, I think thinking about really asking the questions: who's actually doing the outreach with landlords? Are you thinking about it as a neighborhood by neighborhood, right? Because neighborhoods are
Hmm.
communities in and of themselves. I think that's a couple like subtle ways to kind of change organizations' approach to placing people or housing people in different neighborhoods across the city, but in other places as well.
Hmm. That's great. Um, Ashley, is there anything that you wanted to add to that particular question?
No, I've got my eye on the Q&A and I have some thoughts about that.
Okay. Okay, great. And I really appreciate that response, Dr. Dantzler. I think that what I'm seeing in the chat too is a bit of like we are seeing in Canada, and oftentimes led by the example from the United States, is emergency
Hmm.
shelters integrating more housing navigator type resources within their
Yeah.
shelters. And I think sometimes what shelters who may already have housing navigators already are also saying too, like, well, of the 200 people in my shelter, if I have one housing navigator, they can't possibly support 200 people, but they can start to do certain things like build relationships
Hmm.
with landlords, getting a sense of the lay of the land of like who are um, looking at some of those housing market trends and based on neighborhood and things like that, but also getting to know those landlords a bit more intimately and help with the matching. But also to say, if there's only so many resources available, then it's like potentially those that the navigator supports is maybe you prioritize providing extra support to the shelter guests who seem to be
Yeah.
consistently excluded from housing. So we may need to do some prioritization as to who gets matched to the limited housing navigation support that we have. And so you could look at your local shelter data and see who are folks that are staying a long time. And if it tends to be Black guests, Indigenous guests, how are you targeting those for to match to that limited resource that you have?
Yeah. I mean, the other piece about it is that as you're placing people, are you paying attention to the clustering of those households in particular communities or areas, right? And so I know the city has been doing some work with this with the COP program, right? Is that landlords are going to be more likely and different. It's not evenly spread out across the city. There's a lot of concentration of households within particular neighborhoods. And so are you doubling down on that process, or are you also trying to think about what's next in terms of some of the, the market changes across the city or the region? Can you start to identify other areas that may be more advantageous for you to start that process with on an earlier form versus trying to doubling down in an oversaturated space that's constantly housing people, because other people are trying to house people in that same space too. And so there's a lot of overlap across organizations within one local ecosystem. And instead of competing with each other, is that you got to think about long-term collaborations in that space. And so some could be more forward looking versus one that are trying to just like spread out their impact in one area or not.
Right. So even like, yeah, talking about the value of like a scattered site model and constantly trying
Yeah,
to grow into different areas so that you have an array of options.
exactly.
Yeah. I see that we do have some questions in the Q&A. We do have one from someone saying the idea of landlords asking for credit scores and asking for three times the rent keeps people homeless or inadequate housing. How can the government step in? Um, I don't know if either of you want to tackle that first.
Yeah, I mean that's a big policy question. I think one of the things I think the one thing I might be doing in the next couple of years is that I think the study has to be done, the research has to be done about, we have these ideas about what you need to move in a house, and we know these things are actually not good proxies for whether or not a person's going to pay their rent or not, right? And so most of the people I can say as a landlord I don't look at credit scores because most of the people I end up renting to are newcomers to the country. And so they don't have a credit score to come in. A lot of times you need, the age old kind of rental landlord mantra is that you need three times the rental income. But again, that's not usually a good predictor in terms of my experiences as a landlord, whether or not somebody is going to pay their rent on time. I think if anything, I've seen more success with more precarious or lower income households paying their rent on time versus some people who may have more income just based on the keeping their secure household or rent. I mean, there's policy things. I don't think it's nothing individually the organization could do, but advocate, right? And so there are going to be there could be more restrictions on how much money landlords should be asking for in a space. Another thing I think would be useful is having more long-term tenant agreements. And so, even as a landlord, I don't do tenant agreements unless you're going to do at least a year and a half to make sure that the tenant can stay in there long term. And I do that at a freeze rent, and so they don't go up into the rent. And so I think about kind of advocating in the space to have better tenant protections while disaggregating the different types of landlords engaged in this practice, right? For a small time landlord that's just trying to, make their bills pay for that month or only has one or two properties, they're not likely to engage in turnover because it's just a lot of work and a lot of money to swip a unit from tenant to tenant. And bigger apartment buildings that are run by, financialized landlords, as we call them, those are going to be issues where you see a lot more high turnover. And so being mindful of that as you're engaging different types of landlords for your individual, concerns or practices or placements, you notice that there are definitely behavioral differences in how they're approaching getting tenures out or even their approaches to evictions in and of themselves. I think it's a bigger policy question. I think there's things that the LTB needs to do. One thing I would love to see from the landlord and tenant board is also disaggregated race-based data on tenants and landlords so we actually know what's really going on in this space. And so we have some outcomes in people that are experiencing housing security, but we don't have the same type of data to see the actors driving a lot of that insecurity. And so it needs to be equalized. And so secondary to the question, but I do think there's a lot of ways in which organizations can advocate to make the story about landlord and tenant issues a little bit more nuanced than a lot of times is presented in like the media or even in government.
Right. And I appreciate your response too, because I think it shows that there's a need for like kind of like a parallel process to occur of where
Yeah.
there's like large systemic policy questions that we need to look at and challenge, but that doesn't delay what we could be integrating in day-to-day practices while we're waiting for those changes to occur. And so what I
Yeah.
heard from you too there was that I really like that idea of like longer term agreements and understanding and customizing, if you are going to be engaging, doing some outreach to landlords, is like customizing your incentives for like what works and is interesting for smaller landlords versus big landlords, right? So
Hmm.
if I'm thinking I'm a little mom and pop shop with one or two, three units, I can't afford to do lots of vacancy turnover because it's just my
Hmm.
person power to paint, to do whatever, to the administrative cost, to like reposting, all that stuff. So I really care about longer term security, like tenant stability, right? And so then
Hmm.
what are those different and what are those different incentives for kind of those big companies like the Boardwalk rental properties and folks like that? So
Yeah.
customizing your approach, knowing your audience sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, the other piece to that is that large scale, like landlords are quicker to file for an eviction. They have that process already standardized, where a mom and pop might not do that, right? And so we've seen work in, I haven't seen any studies in the Canadian context, but we've seen work in the US context where, what we call mom and pop might actually work with a tenant to like, even if they're behind on rent, get them caught up, or even take a discount just to keep them in there long term for those same reasons to just not disrupt the vacancy or to not to have another vacancy, right? And because a
Hmm.
lot of renters, it's not, the idea that renting is passive is a flawed idea. There's never, as somebody who's been doing this a long time, it's never been passive for me. So I don't understand how we created that kind of idea of it. But in doing so, I think we need to kind of think about to your point, that nuance between people who are like doing this as a professional career versus somebody who's just trying to hold on a house long term for some type of wealth accumulation strategy or something like that.
Hmm. And I think I appreciate too that you have a bit like you have the lived experience of being a landlord yourself. So even something for you to share to say like, here's what I find really valuable to look at when I'm looking at a prospective tenant. And so things like credit score doesn't seem that valuable. So like even something
Mm,
like how are housing focused shelters who may or may not have navigators is trying to like have local landlords as like also local champions who could
yeah,
influence their peers to consider some of housing folks directly out of shelter and Black guests out of shelter. So it's one thing for me as a social worker to talk to a landlord. It's another thing for a landlord to talk to another
yeah.
landlord, like peer to peer from the sector challenges and issues that they both feel like they face together, right?
Yeah, I think the piece that I don't hear enough about in the Canadian space is that our market is really inflated, and so the equity gains that you can get here if you own a property are a lot higher. Depending on the area, they vary, but they're a lot higher than most of what I see in the U.S. And so, we were talking about this at a recent meeting. You could buy a house and just not and go into debt, but know that you were actually making money long term because of the positive equity gains that you were going to. And I think that also relates to the tenancy piece to me, always related to how we think about housing finance. And so most people that own properties here, if you're like an individual owner or a family owner, you're actually, you're probably locked into a 3 or 5 year rate, either fixed or something like that. And so why wouldn't you want to kind of predict your rental income in a similar fashion, right? If I have a tenant that I know is going to be in this space theoretically for 3 years, then I can time up how I'm doing my finance strategies for that particular property. And I think some landlords are actually trying to do that, right? Get a tenant in there and
Hmm.
hope that they stay as long as possible, and just hope for no like major repairs. But at the same time, but the long term tenancy is the game a lot of people will rather have. I think lastly is the thing about, aside from navigators, who's your relationship with realtors, right? And so the realtor I use is the same realtor that helped me find my first apartment. And so we have built that relationship over time. And so those type of things, I think the relationship building piece to think about realtors that you can go to is like, hey, I have tenants right now. Because typically they already have deals with landlords to get that first month's rent payment if you place them successfully. And so there's ways in which it's advantageous for kind of organizations to build relationships with like real estate agents or other kind of real estate teams to do some of this work on their behalf because they get a kickback from the landlords based on as soon as the person moves in.
Hmm. Yeah, I think like many years ago when I was working with a program where we were essentially hiring housing finders, we thought let's actually try to recruit people with real estate backgrounds to be
Yeah.
those housing finders because they're trained in a different way. They speak a different language than social workers, and so and they know the market and they know they have the relationships. to do that engagement, that outreach. And so, yeah, it produces some very cool results when you kind of use that model.
Hmm.
I see that there's a question here that says Indigenous and Black folks are experiencing a lot of the same challenges when it comes to housing. In your community engagement, I saw there were populations identifying as Afro-Latin. Did you come across populations identifying as Afro-Indigenous? And if so, what does equity look like for this particular population?
I haven't. Ashley, did you want to speak to that one?
No, I haven't in my research either.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that's part of the other thing about identification too, right? Is that a lot of these kind of terms, and again, it's the visible minor, like visible piece about homelessness in and of itself. And so I think we're going to be slow to catch up. Not to say that these people don't exist, but I think we're still slower to catch up to get to the more reasonable or accurate numbers in and of it in this space.
Hmm.
And I think that also speaks to some of the challenges with our methodologies for homeless enumeration. Like when we talk about
Yeah.
doing point in time counts as a 24-hour snapshot, one of the issues we have is people who are experiencing what might be called hidden homelessness or couch surfing or who are not immediately visible often do get missed. And so I think there's a lot of challenges with the methodology, including that piece, that mean that we are having a harder time identifying people.
Hmm. And this is purely anecdotal because I don't have any data in front of me, but I would say there could be situations where exactly if you feel that traditional systems and spaces maybe are not meant for you or engage you in the way that you may not be accessing those spaces, and so then we're not actually collecting the information that would be able to identify you and therefore be able to match you with services and opportunities. So this, I think this, your answer might also answer this question, but I don't want to assume. So it says, "Hi, great presentation. I wanted to ask if you could go into more detail about the percentage of Black refugees in Canadian shelter systems. What do you think the relationship is between immigration policies and the number of Black refugees experiencing homelessness compared to other immigrant or even refugee populations?"
Great question. This came up recently when we helped out a group Untitled Planning conduct their secondary community development plan in Mount Dennis area. And so one thing we've noticed is that immigration has a direct impact in terms of how we think about homelessness counts or homelessness policy and housing policy in and of itself. Like I said, there's some colleagues that have been looking at the relationship between immigration policy, like a pathway or a pipeline straight to homelessness. And so even if you're getting people over here, there's a lot of ways in which they're not being able to gain access to housing. I'll give you two different scenarios or situations that we experienced. And so the first was when we were doing community engagement in Moss Park. Some of the rhetoric or discussion we heard from residents about some of the people that they saw experiencing homelessness, that I was like, so is it increasing? Stuff like that. And anecdotally, they was like, yeah, it's definitely increasing. And when you talk to some, we engaged some of the people that are experiencing homelessness, some of them were former construction workers. And so a lot of them used to work on some of those sites that were literally surrounding an area. They got hurt on the job, didn't get access to the right, medication. And then there's a lot of things in relationship to addiction and stuff like that. And so there's ways in which kind of not having access to, secure supports, even through employment, is not benefiting all newcomers or all immigrants in the same way. I think the other flip side, in terms of how even municipalities or different levels of government do policy, is that it is creating a very much what we start to see is a lot of anti-immigrant sentiments among people waiting on housing waiting list. And so one thing that residents said was like, yeah, we understand the need for different core housing groups, but it seems like it's a political swing, and then they just butt the line or cut the line in terms of who's getting housing access. And so there was a lot of ways in which people who were in housing need were starting to grow kind of very much strong anti-immigrant sentiments because of this idea that people are just cutting the line to get occupancy into different spaces. And so I think that's part of the issue in terms of that. Lastly, I would say, immigration policy is affect the immigration regimes, and depending on who's in charge, they have, positive or negative relationships with, host countries that we might be receiving different immigrants on, and that's a bigger conversation. I think about kind of anti-immigration policy or like political swings in terms of like who's our friend and who's our neighbor versus who's our adversary at any given point in time. And I think that's a racialized process in and of itself. And so there's no reason not to understand why you see like large swings of a population switch, but also kind of reproducing some of these same inequalities that we're talking about. And so again, if you're having these immigration policies in place, there has to be housing supports because it's a systems thing, right? And so I think that's part of the issue that you're pointing. I mean, not the same issue, but part of that. Um, I will also point people out. Another one of my colleagues or one of our RAs, Abby Meltzer, she used to work with immigration and refugee settlement services. And so I can definitely circle back and get some more information from her to share with the group through Grant.
That'd be great. And I think that, I've been doing this work for just over 20 years now, and I think that um, the need to continuously develop new skills and understand other sectors.
Yeah,
I've always had it's part of like the evolution of doing this support because we've seen changes in populations of people in shelter that we didn't typically see before. So I think about like for me in the past was having to understand disability supports in Ontario a lot better
yeah,
as we started to see that more coming up in shelter, who's ending up in shelter. Having now we're seeing a lot more older adults experiencing homelessness for the first time, uh, in their 70s, 80s, even 90s, right? So having to understand older adult supports and benefits and navigating that system and similar to like refugees. And so resources or some stuff that you can help direct us with that would be really, really great because I think we can see, just put this out there, I don't think it's a controversial thing to say, like um, emergency shelters oftentimes will feel like as if we're the catch-all for other systems failures,
yeah,
right? So we see these demographic trends that show up in shelters because of other sectors' failures to prevent that experience of homelessness for that particular group that we're talking
yeah,
about. And then inevitably, what I think to your point is to say people who are most impacted by these systemic failures then start to feel through because the scarcity mindset is
hmm
turning their anger towards each other as opposed to
hmm
the system and compete with each other as opposed to expecting more from the systems that put them in these precarious situations.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think that's part of me coming up to Canada was to kind of understand the Canadian social welfare system and its relationship. Because, the US is even more today is starkly going the opposite direction, right? And so it's very much a privatized system in and of itself. And it's related, and it's also based on the kind of understanding of like household wealth, right? And so the more wealth that homeowners and property owners can get, the less reliant they should theoretically would be on the government to do that because they could just draw from their individual asset. What we're seeing now is that the housing crisis isn't just for working class people or even renters, it's for everybody. And so the amount of money that you have to, need to get into that housing market creates these other sentiments in terms of protection. And somebody always say at every talk is like the worst two people are like homeowners and parents when it comes to like protections of one assets or wealth, right? Because they're doing everything they can do in that space to kind of control that asset. And so I do think that there is a failure of government in a lot of different ways. And there's a governance issue, right? Municipalities are what we say creatures of the province. There's a lot of ways in which a top-down approach just doesn't work. To that point, a lot of the people on this call have the kind of day-to-day individual practices. But again, those things take a long time to get institutionalized into some type of city agency or government office. And so even in that space, I think the one thing I've been focused on in the work going and I will continue to do it forward is this idea of storytelling. Like I don't think we have enough information about really is what working out there from a just other than like our organization or a local perspective. And I think for me, it's about highlighting and raising up those stories about organizations that are doing this work that are finding a lot of great outcomes in that space to the idea that it could get institutionalized at a higher up version of government for so that other people can kind of take a ownership of that. And I see that in U.S. history, and I see that somewhat in Canadian history too. And so, a lot of ways to kind of think about what are the practices that you can show, right? And I think it's not an extra step. I think a lot of us do this in the evaluation and monitoring reporting that we have to do anyway in our annual reports. And so, beyond just like the technical report that we share with ourselves or organization, what's the story that we're trying to tell, and what's the actual goals
Hmm.
that we're trying to get into? And I would definitely welcome like organizations on this call or different, government entities to engage with, the idea of storytelling and what is the story we're trying to tell. So that way we could share a lot of the practices beyond our local organizations.
Right. Debbie has a question about how do we make units affordable for individuals who have income of social assistance. So in Ontario, it's ODSP
Yeah.
or Ontario Works.
Yeah. I don't think that's a hard question. I think part of it is that they have to I think I raised this in the beginning, right? And so when we're thinking about how deeply affordable some of these housing units is, that's the only way I can think about doing that is through some type of government programs or stacking finance to secure those housing long term at suitable levels. And so we're thinking about like deeply affordable housing that might be 60 to 80% of the area median income in that space. And so I see some benefits in terms of like all of this housing construction going on, but I worry about that. Is it really going to be at the income levels that it needs to be? One other anecdotal story is like in that same meeting where we were talking about residents around their anti-immigrant sentiments. One thing that came up is like we just literally asked people like, how much could you afford right now to rent an apartment? And we're talking about rates at like $800, $900 a month. And so and that's a really low rent in the area of Toronto where even a basement unit might run you $1,600 to like $2,200 depending on what neighborhood you're in. And so I don't see that being solved at an organizational level or even like an individual level. I think that's like another government policy where we have to have more dedicated housing that's in a deeply affordable space. And I think that's a government funding and financing issue that's thinks beyond the kind of understanding of or the space of shelter communities. The COB program had this, and so they have been constantly increasing that rate of that benefit over time to address the increases in rent. But again, it's not going to be long term. You got to think about how to fund that program long term. And so if your rates are not going up in conjunction with the housing market, I think it's going to be an issue long term where you can't fund those units or you can't increase the amount of people that you actually serve in that space. And so without dedicated funding, I don't know how else that happens.
Hmm. Ashley, did you have a thought or a comment you wanted to add to that? I saw your hand went up for a second there.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit of a different perspective. I actually live here in Northern Ontario, where things are a little bit different than the reality in the GTA. And so for us in Thunder Bay, the average for a one-bedroom apartment is $1,420. So, for individuals who are on ODSP who are receiving 1,400 a month, it just doesn't cut it. And even less so for those who might be on OW receiving about $733 a month. And that's even in a community where housing is significantly more affordable than what we're talking about outside of these southern
Mhm.
urban centers. So I just wanted to add a slightly different geography and highlight the fact that this is something that's going on across Canada, and this is a challenge for our clients, no matter what city you're in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment, and I think it speaks to this piece around like let's start with the assumption that the game is rigged a bit, right? It's like here's this incredibly low income that I'm trying to work with to try and find housing that's very uh, feels very unaffordable. One of the things that I feel very fortunate about in some previous role was I was kind of previous role I was in was to help a community develop its coordinated access system of matching people to housing. One of the things that we saw each month was people experiencing chronic homelessness were actually getting housed each month in greater numbers who were being housed outside of coordinated access than through it even when they
Mm.
had low incomes, even when they weren't didn't have access to a portable housing benefit like COB, and weren't assigned to a housing program. And so me as the person who kind of was implementing this coordinated access system, I thought, how the heck are so many people getting housed without these program supports? And so I had to go directly to them and survey them and ask. And there was a few trends that came out of it. One was folks said I had to reassess what I thought housing was. So I maybe started out thinking it had to be a bachelor or one bedroom apartment in a very specific neighborhood. And then as I spent more time in shelter or on the
Hmm.
streets, I broadened the scope of what I was willing to look at. It still had to be safe, but maybe it was like a room for rent. And this was better than being on the streets or in shelter until I found my next better option.
Yeah.
The other thing was that people said, I really drilled in or tapped into any and all natural informal supports I could think of and asked them if they
Hmm.
had a basement, a room for rent, a granny suite in or outside of the area, whatever it might be. And the third thing that I heard from folks was I connected to a benevolent fund. So you could either like create this within your own organization, or you can reach out to your local community, like charitable groups like churches, or I don't know, whoever it might be, and say, do you want to create a benevolent fund that looks at creating a non-government portable housing benefit program? So if Grant is looking for housing and he's homeless, this church group actually is saying, well, we do our own fundraising through our members and we will do a rent top up of $400 or $500 a month for Grant, so he can find inroads into housing until he doesn't need it anymore. And then we'll help someone else. And so there's some opportunities that way while we know that there's a critical shortage of portable housing benefits available for the number of people that need them,
Yeah.
right? Because one of the things I saw with things like Cobb was like, at least in the communities I worked in, was they were getting used and they would get
Hmm.
used up quickly. And so there is an application for it. It's just they got used up really quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think 2 years ago, maybe a year, yeah, 2 years ago, we had the State of Canadian Cities Summit in Ottawa. That usually happens in December by supported by Canadian Urban Institute. And so I remember it was like a couple of American scholars up there talking about housing vouchers and like the history of housing vouchers in the U.S. And that's very much like how the COD program actually functions. But there's a lot of research on the limits of those type of programs. And so again, very hot housing markets, they will get used up fast, but they long term it's really hard for them to keep up with rent
Hmm.
increases over time, right? And so they do well in lower kind of market or cooler markets, because then that's actually supporting landlords that may not have renters easily available to them then versus hot markets. And so as there's being used, I do think it's a kind of there's a politics to intervention with all this stuff, right? We need to have short term and long term changes. And so in the short term, I do see it as a useful program, but I do worry long term about its viability if those funds aren't topped off or they're not secured to follow, rent increases over time. And so
Right.
you may be able to secure somebody today, but what about in the next 3 to 5 years as that rent increases? Will you be able to still support that same household to stay in place? Because the worst thing you will want is so that for that person to re-enter the issue of being housing insecure or homeless or experiencing homelessness based on a government program that's just not suited for the market that it's in.
Right. I'm very mindful of the time, so I'm going to end this with like a very short and specific question. Is it legal for landlords to ask for credit scores and things like bank statements?
As far as I know, it's legal. um, I've been asked this. I think there's one person I will point to is like Downtown Legal Services, who we've been working with a little bit at University of Toronto, has been doing a lot of this work in terms of educating tenants on their rights, but also dealing with issues around tenants. It has been shocking to me the amount of paperwork that landlords ask here, especially if you don't have a credit score, right? And so, even as a professor, I had to give 6 months of post-dated checks, bank statements, employment verification, my US tax return. Like it was a crazy situation. And again, I don't think there's a lot of knowledge about what can or what cannot be accessed, and some of it is not even addressed in some of the landlord and tenant rules or rights or tenants rights. And so yeah, I'm not even sure if all that is technically legal, but it is a common practice among
Hmm.
landlords to ask for credit scores or bank statements or just any type of proof of income to verify that.
Hmm. And I think maybe what I can circulate too is there's a resource that was developed in Ontario that kind of gave a guide to people around like what landlords can and cannot ask, but then how to
Yeah.
also navigate that difficult conversation when landlords do ask for something in a way
Hmm.
that they shouldn't be asking for, but in a way that doesn't push them away from like even wanting to rent from you. So there's a nuance, there's a dance to how to deal with those kind of uh, touchy situations. But I can make sure to send
Yeah.
those out with the resources from today's session. So we do have to kind of wrap up there. I do just want to take one moment to remind folks that If you're interested in being a member and getting information about CSTN, to follow that QR code. I will be sending out an email with all the content from today's webinar. I want to thank everybody for attending, for asking your questions, your participation, and I do want to give a big thank you to our presenters, Dr. Dantzler and Ashley Wilkinson. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge with everyone here today. It's truly appreciated. And it's been a pleasure working with the both of you in preparation for this event.
Thank you, Grant. We appreciate it. And feel free to anybody on the call, feel free to reach out anytime to either one of us.
Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, with that, I wish everybody a great Wednesday afternoon and look forward to sending out information about our February session very soon. So keep an eye out for that. Be well, everyone. Stay warm out there. Bye for now.